Good morning. Did you know pastors have post-Holy Week hangovers? I've got one bad this year. I looked at all these questions. It's like, oh man, they're asking me questions. Let's just sit around and talk today. That's what I feel like doing. I don't feel like me talking. Maybe maybe we should just go around. We only have a few people in the chat room right now. Maybe everybody should just say a little something about themselves. How were your last 2 weeks? We'll start with Andre. Andre, can you talk?
Yep. It was my birthday.
Happy
couple
birthday.
Of days back.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I told you I was going to be on here again, but I didn't know I was going to do this. I thought I was going to answer questions. I don't know if I'm going to answer questions today.
I have faith in you, Paul.
Well. How was your birthday? Did you have a good birthday?
Yeah, it was pretty quiet. Just had a dinner with my parents on different days, and it's just a quiet, nice turning 33.
33. I think it felt old when I turned it. Now it looks young. So enjoy it.
I am so far.
Good. All right, who's next? Andrea with the bangs. I was giving Andrea a hard time on Twitter this morning.
Like, no. I'm just sewing. I'm adding a button to a blouse, and I don't really have things to really talk about at the moment.
Tell me about the decoding the gurus guys. I haven't watched that video.
Oh, why did you bring them up? I've been like going through an existential crisis about how to be friends with people that do not like each other. Anyways, I was not thinking you would bring that up. It's fine. What do you want to know about it?
Well, how did that happen? How did you get them on your channel? I thought you were on our side.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for drawing lines. My husband thinks you're hilarious. So, this was before I actually had Chris Kavanaugh on my channel years ago, before I even was part of Bridges of Meaning, I think. And I just liked the pushback against the just blind following of some of the things. I didn't like all of his takes. I like some and I don't like others. And then he started decoding the gurus, and I had him and his co-host Matt on, and then I had them on again this past year as a follow-up because they were able to interview Sam Harris, and I wanted to talk to them about that. And then he decided to go friggin' pick on Peugeot. And I'm like, no, why? I don't really want to have to sometimes people have good, critiques, and then sometimes people have unfair critiques. And I think that's true of these guys. You just kind of have to, it depends on which take they're talking about.
But to pick on
that's where I'm at.
He's our guru. Can't pick on
he
our
is,
guy.
I know, and that's the thing. Well, here's the problem for me, Paul, that I was having trouble kind of reconciling. So I wrote Chris and Matt saying hey, are you I've interviewed Peugeot, or does this mean I'm not associating with people that you're not okay with now, and then that's tainting me, And they're like, no, it's not about that. It's just more, if you're going to be talking to someone for 3.5 hours, bring up some of these questionable things. They kind of put a moral responsibility to if I interviewed Jordan Peterson, and this is not what I say should, this is what is expected of certain people in the anti-woke communities, which is what Chris and Matt are. It'd be like, oh, you know that, what's the guy's name who's the leader of Hungary? That guy?
Yeah. Rod Dreher loves him.
Okay. Well, it would be like, well, hey, like if you're going to be responsible and you have these people's ear, question them about why they're okay with like speaking with, say, authoritarian style, whatever. And you don't have to, like, obviously, if I was going to do it, I wouldn't be doing it in an accusatory way. But like that's sort of their perspective of just hold these people to account about questionable things. Now, but that's the thing for me is if I'm speaking with Pajot, I'm wanting to talk about symbolism, not who he's okay with going on a podcast and, to talk to. So that's where I don't really know what I think, and I have to figure that out. If, say, some of these things, like holding people to account, I don't know that it's always the time and the place. But I'm thinking about it. But wow, I didn't think that I'd go into this. Does that make sense? Does that
It makes
a good
perfect sense.
answer?
It makes perfect sense. So I'm glad
But
that you shared that with us, because you talked to them, and so I might have to talk to Joey about banning you from the Discord server, because we
well,
can't have
because
people
I know
talk
I've
to people on
associated
the
with.
wrong list.
I know I am. I apparently associating with certain people. I think this happened in first century Palestine too.
I think a guy got crucified because of it.
Yeah.
Oh, well, thank
Anyways,
you,
we can move
Andrea.
on from me. Yeah, now
Yes,
that I've
thank you for
compared
being
myself with
willing to.
Jesus, it's really appropriate. Yeah. Sorry,
Anybody
please
else want to
continue.
throw something into the mix so I can avoid answering questions?
I want to ask you for something really quickly, unless someone else wants to say something.
No, go right ahead. I just said I wanted to avoid answering questions, so go ahead and give me your question.
Well,
I'm kidding. Go
just
ahead.
now before I got home, someone drove into my bike, and it angered me. And I thought maybe I could let them go, but I decided to go after them because they just cycled away. And when I confronted them about it, they first denied it, and then they started accusing me of making a mistake, which I think I wasn't in traffic, like the mistake of standing still.
How dare you?
I know, right? At a very busy point with lots of cars moving, how dare I stand still and let the car move? But then I got angry and I did something I should not do. Like I smacked the other guy on the back of his head with my keychain, and he cycled after me and he pushed me into a bunch of plant pots. And I think one thing I struggle with is when I'm outside of the moment, I can accept that, God will have an ultimate perfect judgment. But when I'm inside that moment, it's much harder to see. And I do something like that, which is completely wrong. And I shouldn't do it, right? But I still did it.
I'm with you, man. Somebody's been dumping couches here at the church, and boy, I'll tell you, I saw the trucks on the little camera we have here. It's kind of a unusual looking truck. When I find that truck, I'm going to be in that guy's face. I don't know if that's a good idea. And I've had a week to think about it, and I still want to be in the guy's face. So yeah, figuring out how to handle these kinds of things. And you have a Dutch accent, so I assume you're talking about a bicycle.
Yes.
Because I know bicycles are big in the Netherlands, and if you're on a bicycle in the midst of cars, you're awfully vulnerable. And so I hear you. And figuring out what the right thing to do. And that actually intersects with Andrea's point, because an irony of that whole, well, let's see, the first time I talk to someone, I have to zero in on whatever is salient in that person's life in terms of their moral defect. I see pastors do that a lot, and I seldom find it improves much. And so this neo-Pharisee, I don't want to insult the Pharisees, so I won't use that.
Thank you.
But this idea that you're just this constant moral nerve ending that is looking around to Oh, Jordan Peterson said something wrong. I must go and call him to account. Who the heck are you to call him to account? But if you're on the bike and someone is monkeying with you, or if you're at church and someone's dumping sofas because they don't want to drive all the way to the dump, which means that just me and Rick and Jared and Roger and Maury got to handle your freaking couch or what's left of your apartment remodel that you just dump onto the church grounds. Yeah, I get angry. So I get it.
They make a step for that, guys.
What's that?
I said they make a step for that, guys.
Yeah, go ahead and tell us about it, Chad.
Well, it's called the fourth step, and it addresses my own shortcomings and there's a defect, like my capacity to be extremely annoyed for either a very good reason or no good reason at all. And it has me really aimed at what are my mistakes in each situation, and it's a son of a bitch. But without it, I would probably wither up and die. So, anyway, sorry for cutting in.
Don't apologize, Chad. Don't apologize. I was watching a whole bunch of the Bridges of Meaning Hub channel yesterday because, again, I had to get my sermon done, so I got my sermon done. But you'll notice I haven't made any fresh content this week just because it's been crazy busy, and I've still got my post-Easter hangover. And Rick and I had an awesome road trip to see Jordan and Tammy, and that was great. And but I'm just tired, and we've got this big push right now to do this fence, and it's just I have to do a graveside service this Saturday. Saturday's usually my day off, but this is a special situation, so I said yes. And so I'm just tired. And then some of you guys asking hard questions. They're good questions, but they're hard questions, and some of the hardest questions are the short questions. So, but hey, it's awfully good to be here. Sorry I haven't done any Thief in the Night videos lately. Again, I'm still shoveling out of work to do, and just all kinds of work. So anyway, what do you say, Rick? Should I answer some questions? Rick says, oh, you might as well. I don't even know. I think Theo La Lusa from the 8th snuck a question in before I said no more questions. Regarding what you mentioned about people that do not allow themselves to be loved, my dad is like that. Any advice? Number 1, pray. That's easy advice to give, and it's good advice. Prayer isn't an excuse for inaction, and prayer itself isn't inaction. Prayer is remarkably difficult, but you should definitely pray for your dad. Number 2, C.S. Lewis says the door to hell is locked from the inside. The door to many people's personal hells is also locked from the inside. And people are amazingly complex, and when it comes right down to it, remarkably difficult to help. And usually it's quite unusual to be able to provoke a situation in which they can get better. And so pray and love. And what does that mean? Figure out how to love your father well. Try not to violate his agency. It's not your job to fix him or to force whatever solution you think will work upon him. Those kinds of efforts seldom bear good fruit. But a lot of helping people is sort of watchful waiting. And when you see that maybe they've unlocked the door and they've opened it a crack and are peeking out, and then being ready for that moment and figuring out what to do in that moment that will encourage them not to slam the door shut again, but to maybe open it a little bit more and speak a little bit of their fearful truth and maybe encourage them to open it a little bit more. People are afraid, and it doesn't matter if they're 3 or 30 or 80. People are afraid, and part of how you often help people is encourage them. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't moments of provocation that are important, but I see people who major in provocation, and then they'll tell you the story of the one time that the provocation worked out really well, and they won't tell you about the 100 times provocation just met with the door slamming and locking again. So it's remarkably difficult to help a human being, especially when they've locked themselves in their own personal hell. So, all right. Oh, Chad the Alcoholic has a question. Let's get ahead of the game here, because he asked it the last day we did question and answer. Regarding one of the previous questions about the Enlightenment and patterns and such, what's the re-enlightenment going to look like? Well, it depends on what you imagine re-enlightenment is. The video that I had in my mind of doing this morning was, there'll be elements of it that are in the sermon. No matter how tired I am, Sunday comes and a sermon must be preached. So there'll be a sermon on Sunday. Trust me. It's one of the beautiful things about jobs and accountability. But Susanna Black, I think she writes over at The Plow, Mennonite outfit. They're not Hutterites there. I forget the name of their community. Julian would know. She had an interesting string on Twitter that referenced a Vanity Fair article, which was quite interesting, and a little podcast called Wet Brain, and the particular episode is Divine Intervention. And this morning on my walk, I listened to Curtis Yarvin on the Stoa. That was so far my favorite Curtis Yarvin interview. His name has been around quite a bit, and I've tried to listen to him on a variety of other podcasts, and sometimes it was sort of inscrutable. But because I know Peter Lindbergh a bit, and I have a lot of respect for the Stoa, and the Stoa is very much in this little corner of the internet, I thought Peter, of course, asked great questions, and a lot of the other people at the Stoa asked great questions, and I thought they got a lot of interesting stuff out of Curtis. And it gets into a whole bunch of stuff. See, on one hand, I haven't had time to make videos, and I'm a little bit tired and grumpy, partly because of the sofas. And there's a roach dying in the middle of the sanctuary floor that I told Rick about. I told Rick to go shake the poor little fella's hand as he shuffles off this mortal coil. But so at the same time, I've got all of these videos bottled up inside of me. I've got Peugeot and Kingsnorth, and Peugeot and Lindsay, and Peugeot and Weinstein, and a whole bunch. I've got like a ton of Peugeot videos bottled up inside of me that I want to talk about, and just haven't been able to. But then I saw this Yarvin video, and I read this Vanity Fair article about Peter Thiel, and I listened to this other podcast, and yeah, how does that have to do with any of these things? Oh yeah, the re-enlightenment. A lot of what's going on in this little quarter of the internet is sort of Yarvin is actually quite helpful in this, because he sort of highlights differences between, let's say, monarchy and democracy and oligarchy and some of his thoughts. And I might do a commentary, if I can find the time, on that Stoa video with Yarvin, because those kinds of issues are really quite central to what's going on here. The Peugeot Weinstein video has everything to do with whether or not human beings and our institutions and systems and cultures are actually in charge of this world, which in many ways, if you're a Christian or even anyone who is practicing an ancient religion, you would say, no, we're not in charge of this world. Other things are. Principalities, powers, God, spiritual forces. So there are a lot of different lines between a lot of these conversations. Virginia Beach is calling me. I have no idea why. And so re-enlightenment out of all these different corners of the world and of the internet is going to mean a lot of different things. And so part of trying to sort through all of the very interesting little voices we have going is to sort of figure out that re-enlightenment. And that's going to have a lot to do with this Christian theological term, eschatology, or last things. The conversation I did earlier in the week with Grail Country and Sherry and Jedediah and let's see, it was Nate and me and Sherry and Jedediah. Oh yeah, and James. That was all about eschatology and Dugan's vision of eschatology. So it's going to be very interesting to see what enlightenment reaches critical enough mass in what corner of the world to qualify for the prefix re. So there's my answer to that, Chad. Hope it was helpful. Hey, Grim Grizz, got the t-shirt and got the mug in the mail. Thank you. I don't know why you would ask the question, tell us more about monkeys full of snakes. Here I've got the lobster monkey from the Grim Grizz tribe. I don't drink coffee. So, and I got this. I want to show this. This is from the husband of a woman in my church. Isn't that beautiful? It's just really gorgeous. Can't see it real well because I got this really fast lens. So when you see it back here, you'll know what it is. And I got this from dude on Twitter. It's like, show the artwork. And what about the gift that Chad the alcoholic left me? Well, there's that. Come on, camera. There's the little faces. You can focus on them. There they are. Look at that lens. Look at that lens. That's a good lens. Anyway. See, part of the problem is when I'm tired, my ADHD sort of has its way with me. You might find that fun. My wife has long since found it annoying. Anyway, okay, Grim Grizz, monkeys full of snakes. That's Peterson's term. That's Peterson's anthropology. And so maybe to say a little bit about the so the Peterson book tour, I've had some conversations with some people, and they'll know who I'm talking about, but none of the rest of you will, and that's okay. You know, I think part of the question beyond the Peterson book tour is that everyone goes there expecting it's going to be about the book, and it's not about the book. It's a little bit about the book, but they start out about the book and end about the book. But it's in many ways what Peterson is doing on that tour is what I do in a lot of my videos. He's just thinking out loud. And if you like hearing him think out loud, you'll like being there. One of the things, so that when Rick and I met with Jordan and Tammy, he asked for a lot of feedback, which was really quite cool. And that's one thing about Peterson that I think we often forget. He is a social scientist, and what that means is he is always looking for data. And he asked if we liked better the presentation or the question and answer. And I hadn't really thought that through, so I kind of shrugged. And Rick was quicker on the uptake, and he said the Q&A. So if you see more Q&A and less monologuing, you know, you can blame or thank Rick for that. I got to figure out what I should and shouldn't say about all this stuff. But anyway, Rick and I had a terrific meeting with Jordan and Tammy, and there were a couple of people from the agency CAA that he works with there. And I talked about estuary and the need for people to have spaces to process change in their lives. And so, no, it was about a half hour that we got to hang out with them and talk about some stuff. And I I have a Substack, Grim Grizz will tell you about his Patreon. Mark will tell you about Navigating Patterns, that amazing YouTube channel actually I think the conversation about intimacy crisis is on Andrea's channel. But I have a Substack, and you can get in early, less than 1,000 subscribers, and it's totally free. I have no ads on my Substack, so subscribe to the Substack, especially if you don't have time to listen to all my videos, because part of the reason I do the Substack is because most of us, unless we have jobs or lifestyles that permit it, don't have near enough time to listen to all of the great content that's being put out, and even some of the crappy content. So I did the Substack so I could have the chance to distill some of my thoughts in much more compact form. And what I do is I do it on Twitter, and then I record the tweets on the Substack. So that way, I found, especially when I'm short of time, I don't have time to make a video, but I do have time to write a little bit on Twitter. So Twitter is getting some of my attention and some of my output, but not everybody should be on Twitter. So if you don't want to be on Twitter and you want to know what I think my more important tweets are, you can just subscribe to the Substack. It's free. They'll send you the email every time I post something. So then I wrote a Substack about how the women in Jordan's life are making him better, because I think Michaela has really grown into a fine podcaster, and she's had a lot. She's gone through a divorce now. She's in process of sorting out her religious life. She's got a child. She's running a business. She's been with her father and her mother, almost dying. So she's gained, and she's suffered enormously through her medical issues. So she's gained some wisdom in her short life. I think she's doing a good job. And one of the things that Rick and I both noted is that Tammy is really a treasure. I haven't listened to her second talk with Peugeot yet. And the first one started out a little rough. Peugeot was kind of going through some basic stuff. And so I'd started listening to it about 3 or 4 times. And then when I knew I was probably going to meet with them both, I thought I should at least finish this. And towards the end of that first episode with Peugeot, she really comes to life. And she has a lot of wisdom too. And she's quite a bit more quiet than Jordan. She's not sort of the motor mouth that Jordan is. And one of the, I think, best parts in the show, if we call it that, in Santa Rosa, where Rick and I went, was the question and answer. Tammy did it, and she picked the questions. And I think she will help Jordan stay. So if politics is now and religion is always, and politics is cents, CENTS, and religion is dollars, I think Tammy helps keep Jordan much more towards the dollars and the always, rather than the cents and the now. And I think Jordan is at his best. It's my opinion, of course. I think Jordan is at his best when he's addressing the perennial rather than the immediate. I know, getting in digs at Justin Trudeau, and we'll get applause lines, but I think his better contribution is around the psychological, the symbolic, and I think again, this is my opinion, the most interesting aspect of his work is wrestling with where the physical and the narrative worlds meet. And so I think Tammy helps draw his attention. So if the man is the head and the woman is the neck, I think Tammy helps draw his attention to better things. And so I hope he keeps collaborating with her And I hope she becomes more and more of an active part of what he's working on. So, I distract myself. Yeah, this next question, boy. Rick tempted me before. He said, well, let's just delete the questions that you don't want to answer and say that Joey did it. Said, no, Rick, we shouldn't do that. Some of these are hard. Twirly Ka 22 says, hello, Paul. How much do you think Christ wants us to have anything to do with any of those institutions? I'm not quite, it was 2 weeks ago since I did this before, so I don't know exactly which institution. So I'll keep reading. Are not most of these institutions the same as the Pharisees, who he called whitewashed tombs? You know, I got a soft spot for the Pharisees, and it should be noted that Pharisees became at least a slice, an important slice of the early church. And I often note to people that of the particular factions that we know about that Jesus was contending with, in many ways, he's closer to the Pharisees than to the Essenes or to the Zealots or to the aristocracy. So, you know, I've taken it upon myself to be a little less, to not use the word Pharisees in the way that Christians have been using that word. Because, well, Jesus was pointing out when he's using that whitewashed tombs phrase that there was a degree of hypocrisy. Jesus also said, your righteousness should surpass that of the scribes and Pharisees. Jesus also said, you should do what the scribes and Pharisees tell you to do, but don't do what they do. So the picture of Jesus' relationship with the certain of the religious factions, including the scribes and the Pharisees, is a little bit more complex than what especially came out of the Protestant Reformation, which eventually said something like, well, Catholics are about the law because they have a pope, and Jews are about the law, and so Protestants live by grace. Now, I very much understand that. And anybody who listens to my sermons knows that I deeply respect the Heidelberg Catechism. But I think a lot of contemporary, I think a closer reading of the New Testament and the Gospels will reveal that you cannot simply dismiss Roman Catholics, nor what today we call Judaism, Pharisaical Judaism, let's say, as law keeping versus grace living. It's way too low resolution to actually deal with those communities. So, you know, it's kind of like the pastor once where I was talking to him about his church. It was a church in Southern California. It was a very conservative Reformed church. And he basically said, yeah, the Vietnamese all go Roman Catholics because they all worship statues. And it's like, I think that's a little bit of a low resolution view of the matter, especially given the fact of French colonization in Vietnam, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, institutions. Well, let's see what institutions you're talking about. I don't see much where he encourages untidy with the world if we go off the pattern of Genesis 1, Genesis 3, Genesis 6, Genesis 9, Genesis 11, and so on. He wants us to be holy, separate. He is the separator, separate from the sin of the world. And every story Christ told us is about separation. Genesis 1, every line is about separation, delineation. Then we have the tree of the knowledge of right and wrong, good and evil. Basically, how to make decisions, how to separate correctly. Yeah, and that was the one they weren't supposed to eat from, remember? We don't just We say you don't know or will know how to make decisions in this form without leading you. And sorry, was typing. You guys have a great day. I was listening to there's another video that I want. I can't listen to a good video and not want to make a video commentary on it. That's just me. But I don't have time to sit down and do it to every video I listen to. So I was listening to a Doug Wilson video. Hey, Rick, you can see that I'm here using my computer. Oh yeah, this is the video. This is the video by Doug Wilson. The sexuality debate at Wheaton, and the thumbnail was gay versus gay. So, if I'm going to pick on people, I probably shouldn't pick on Catholics or Jews, although, I'm not going to say I'll never will, but I might as well pick on people in my own little subsection of the world, someone like Doug Wilson. And part of the reason is because he's theologically a cousin of mine. The theonomists, the reconstructionists, conservative, reformed, postmillennialists. And if you watch that video, basically what he says is Wesley Hill should not have talked to this woman at Wheaton. Wesley Hill was sort of advocating a traditional approach to human sexuality with respect to same-sex attraction and behavior. And the other person in the debate at Wheaton was advocating an affirming position. No big surprise that Wheaton would host such a debate. And Doug Wilson's big takeaway on that was, well, Wesley Hill should talk to anybody who doesn't identify as Christian, but once someone identifies as Christian and has a wrong idea about something like homosexuality, you should treat them as a what? As an enemy, as a reprobate. Okay. First of all, Wheaton is not a church. Wheaton is a university. There's something really attractive and noble and defensible about what Doug Wilson was saying and doing there. He has a point. The difficulty in life is figuring how to relate to the world as it comes at you. So part of what we have in our culture is we have people that major on the antithetical. What do I mean by that? We began talking about Andrea and how she's soft on decoding the gurus, and how Andrea was supposed to be a safe space for all us IDW types. And there she goes and gives aid and comfort to decoding the gurus. She's eating with them. Well, I don't know if she's actually eating with them, because we don't do a lot of eating here on Zoom or the internet, but she's platforming decoding the gurus. How horrible. When she had decoding the gurus on her channel, it was her job to stick up for this little corner of the internet and say, no, our gurus are right. And these other woke-ish people out there are destroying the world. So that's the antithetical. And the antithetical is real. There's a place for it. It's right. And Jesus, as you point out, and the Bible, is sometimes enormously antithetical. A lot of people today, however, like to see Jesus not as antithetical, but as receptive. And so somebody posted on my Twitter feed a really nice little meme, which basically had it was a meme from the Christian left that basically said white colonial Jesus had all these bad things and the real Jesus had all these good things. And so I encourage people to, well, why don't you read the canonical Gospels? And you know what? There'll be times when Jesus does things that you really like. Oh, Jesus eats with sinners and tax collectors. Jesus is welcoming and accommodating to the sinful woman who washes his feet and wipes them with her hair. And Jesus is against the Pharisees. Now, if you just sit down and think about this, you'll notice that you really can't have the world without both reception and antithesis. You have yes and no. And one of the amazing things about Jesus is often his yes is so radical that we look at it and say, that's irresponsible. And then his no is so strident and demanding, and we look at it and say, that's unattainable. And what's amazing about Jesus, and this is where Peugeot is right about how he fills up the hierarchy, Jesus gets both the yes and the no right. His yes is so broad that he looks irresponsible. Jesus, how dare you eat with sinners and tax collectors? Luke 15. The other side, well, let's read Matthew 23. Jesus, how dare you call them whitewashed tombs? Jesus is both more antithetical than we think any balanced person should be, and more receptive than we think any holy person should be. I think each of us, by culture and by temperament, will tend to err on one side or the other. I am probably way too erring, and Jacob may very well say amen like he's in a black church. I am way too erring on the receptive and the welcoming. I'm just a crazy soft-lined lib who I'll have the Decoding the Guru people on my channel. I won't even have a fight. I'll have Kristen Kobes-Dumay, and I won't challenge her on all of the things that my friend Hank Cruz wants me to challenge her on. And is it because I'm a coward? Probably. Lack courage? Probably. But sometimes I'm more dogmatic and antithetical than other people would like. So we're all a mixture of these things. And then when we see that duality, we tend to want to think in terms of balance. I should balance my receptivity and my loving welcoming to sinners and tax collectors, and my holiness, righteous judgment against the wobbly. And I don't think balance is the right idea, because balance tends to mean kind of a zero-sum game. And I don't find Jesus doing that. What Jesus is able to do is contextually figure out when and where and with whom he must be absolutely holy. Just read the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard it said this and this and this, that he's mostly looking at the law of Moses. But I tell you, he intensifies the law of Moses in the Sermon on the Mount. He wants, and in the Gospel of Matthew, you think you should attain to the righteousness, the circumspection and the precision and the ardor of the scribes and Pharisees? No, you must surpass them, Jesus says in the Gospel of Matthew. Wow. That sort of undercuts the idea that Well, the problem with Pharisees is that they're narrow-visioned, judgmental, legalistic hardliners. Jesus in some ways says, you need to be more hardline than them. And so when I listen to Doug Wilson, I think, you know what? He's hardlining. And that's not wrong. It's not wrong to hardline. We need hard lines in our life. If I would decide to sleep with another woman and then go to my wife and say, well, honey, I'm just really a nice guy, and so I decided to sleep with that other woman. Well, I'm going to tell you something. My wife is going to bring a hard line really fast. Even if part of the reason she was attracted to me is how I have a capacity to be generous to heretics and the heterodox. So it's not a matter of balance. It's a matter of figuring out when, where, and how to be a hard liner, and when, where, and how to be radically loving. So, and Jesus does that. And so, you'll read the Sermon on the Mount and say, wow, those are hard lines. And then he goes and now, see, again, people don't recognize, where was he when that sinful woman of the village came and, washed his feet with her tears and dried them with her hair? He was feasting with Pharisees. Now, this is where things get really weird. And where people who are like, if you're going to sit down with Jordan and Tammy, you'd better confront Jordan on what exactly? Because what you tell me to confront him on is much more of a reflection of your view of Jordan. And you might have all sorts of skepticism about what God does and doesn't know, and God doesn't demand. But you have no such skepticism in terms of what you think you know and demand of other people. So, the antithesis and common grace, that's how it's talked about in the Kuyperian Dutch Calvinist tradition. The antithesis and common grace is always with us. And it's not a matter of balancing them. It's a matter of having the wisdom and judgment to apply them when and where. And so when it comes to my sexual desire, I need to be kind of a hard liner, If someone comes up and said, "Oh, Paul, I'd like to sleep with you," the answer is no. And it's always no. And it doesn't matter how I feel, and it doesn't matter how lovely you are or how nice you've been. The answer is always no, because I'm a married man. Done. No conversation, no discussion. It's just no. And that's exactly the way it should be. But now, Decoding the Gurus, Chris Kavanaugh sends me a tweet and says, "Paul, let's have a conversation." Absolutely. Jacob says, "Paul, I want you on my channel." Absolutely. Kristen Cobes-Dumais says, "Paul," she hasn't, but says, "Paul, I want to come back on your channel and let's talk about my book. Let's really get into it." Okay, I'll do that. I'm happy to do that. So we need to have both the antithesis and the gracious. And the question is when to apply, with whom to apply. And so Jesus is feasting in the house of a Pharisee. And, they platformed him, I guess, but then they didn't extend hospitality to him. And Jesus calls them up on that. And he makes the point that this sinful woman, for whatever reason, she lets down her hair. That's in that world, in that culture, that's a very provocative thing. And so then, on the minds of the Pharisees, they're thinking, if Jesus really is like this powerful prophet that everybody thinks that he is, he would know that what's going on with this woman with respect to his feet, this is inappropriate. Yeah, duh. But Jesus takes it to another level. Then he says, wait a minute. I came to your feast and you didn't extend hospitality to me. Now, you all know the scriptures and you all have read the ending of the book of Judges and you've all read the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Story of Sodom and Gomorrah, oh, sure, there's gay stuff in it, but it's about hospitality. You know, when someone comes into the town, it's not like, ha, fresh meat, bend over, buddy. It's, oh, you're a stranger. Come into my home. Let me feed you. Let me welcome you. And then, of course, the strange thing when Job offers his daughters to the town, we look at that, oh, Job, that's horrible. No, that's an expression of hospitality. So a little radical hospitality, but that's what the conversation is about. And it doesn't mean that sexual ethics no longer apply, but that's what the conversation's about. And so then when Jesus goes to the home of a Pharisee, on one hand, Jesus is accommodating to them because there's certainly some tension between Jesus and the Pharisees. And Jesus is saying, I'm willing to come to your home. Whereas earlier we had the story of someone who was, who a centurion that says to Jesus, hey, I understand the complexity of you coming to my home. So Jesus comes to their home and they don't extend hospitality to him. But this woman who could have been a prostitute, could have been a sexual sinner of some sort in the town, is caring for Jesus intimately and personally and out in public, and they take offense. And Jesus basically says, he calls them to account on the law that they already embrace and says, you should have extended me hospitality because that's what a righteous person does. And there we get to the crux of the matter. And the question again isn't balance. Well, they've got the antithesis, and then we have, let's say, mutuality or common grace or love or acceptance, something like that. I'm going to split the difference. No. You have to figure out when you need to be more dogmatic and disciplined than Doug Wilson and more generous and extending than Rob Bell. Because Rob Bell just looks like, it's all, love wins. Doug Wilson looks like hard lines. You have to figure out when you need the hard line and when you need the radical generosity. So, there's a sermon. Thanks for giving me the chance to get that one out there. That's why I like doing these questions and answers. So, I'm sorry.
Paul, can I?
Yes.
Sorry, can I ask a follow-up question on?
Absolutely.
Pick your brain about sort of this idea of balance, because it's a very interesting word, and it's like you like to say, it's a word that fudges. Because I think when a lot of people hear balance, they do hear like this middle ground where it's like right in the middle, and so you're like pulling yourself. But when I think of what it means to physically balance things, in a lot of ways, especially if you're balancing something on its unnatural center, it does look very extreme, where often you have to have a certain amount weighted sort of very far than another to keep it balanced because of its weight. And I'm wondering if you think that the idea of balance itself is wrong, or if our perceptions in which we understand balance as this sort of middle of the road process is more the issue.
Yeah, I think you're right. Because balance, I think part of it is, again, consciousness is monofocal. And the monofocality of consciousness creates dualisms. And so I think you're right in that there's a way in which balance is a very good image of what we should strive for, because balance is all about contextuality. Balance isn't balance as such. Balance has everything to do with the ground and gravity and my feet or the mass that we're trying to manage. And so, no, I think it's a great point, Cassidy. It's a great point. Cool. Bazani. Oh, this is from a super chat last week. I've never heard you speak more than in passing about John MacArthur, a rather famous fellow California Calvinist. How would you compare yourself to him in terms of theology, approach, etc.? I've never given John MacArthur very much attention. My low resolution impression of John MacArthur is that he's sort of a Calvinist fundamentalist culture warrior. But, you know, I've in looking in some of the things that I've heard, it's, you know, so he's a secessionist. Well, what does that mean? So one of the dualities that has developed in the late 20th century after the rise of the Pentecostal movement is, do miracles happen? And John MacArthur says, not anymore. Miracles were part of the apostolic age, but we shouldn't expect miracles to happen. I find that position frightfully modernist. And you'll hear, you know, a theme that's been coming through and will probably continue to come through is a continual attempt to try to spring the word miracle from its modernist shackles. So, for example, and, you know, I'll use Tammy Peterson and Michaela Peterson. Tammy Peterson got a diagnosis of terminal cancer. Tammy Peterson, on YouTube, you can find the story, talks about some visioning, some praying of sorts. She's working the rosary, and she's healed. Did Tammy Peterson receive a miraculous healing? Now, very quickly, a lot of stuff floods in. Oh, she didn't go see Benny Hinn or any one of these televangelists and, you know, have her fall over on stage. Was her healing miraculous? Well, she had a terminal diagnosis, and then the doctor says, no, you're fine now. Well, what happened? How do we know? If we don't know, is it a miracle? I like Michaela's example even better. Michaela and she tells the story in a cup. She told it to Jonathan Peugeot. She told it in this other video that I used a clip of. She's just had a lot of, I mean, you got to feel for this woman. I mean, this woman in her 30 years not only had to deal with a debilitating disease, had to find her own diet, had her father and her mother almost die, you know, became pregnant out of wedlock, married, and now divorced. You got to feel for this girl. And she's doing this now over the last number of years in public. That makes it all the harder. So, you know, yeah, she's got anxieties and difficulties in her life. Absolutely. I think any of us can see that. And so a friend tells her to call out to God and ask God for help. And she wasn't raised in a Christian household as such. And so she doesn't know how to pray, and she doesn't know much about the Bible. And her father's a scientist and who has all kinds of other strange and interesting ideas. And so she decides she'll pray to God. And that next week, everything that she was anxious about sort of works out. Now, will this win her $1 million from the amazing Randy? No. If she uses the word miracle, should some of us call the language police? No. Neither when Tammy talks about it. And so part of what's happened is that miracle has become enslaved by the modernist police. Oh, that's a miracle is a violation of supernatural. Is me moving my hand supernatural? Is my employing of reason supernatural? Read C.S. Lewis's Miracles. It's a deeply modernist book, but the times they are a-changin'. So, no, MacArthur is a Calvinist of a certain stripe, of which there are many. And here's one of the realities of this world. Rob Bell gets a lot of love for being squishy. Doug Wilson gets a lot of love for being a hardliner. You can make a big career by being squishy, and you can make a big career by being a hardliner. Most of us are not so much one or the other, and in that case, we're not terribly remarkable. So John MacArthur gets a lot of press. He's got some big ministries. He's really part of this, even though he's not young and their traditions aren't young, but in the emergent movement after sort of the peak of the seeker movement, the emergent movement followed, of which Mark Driscoll and Nadia Bolz-Weber and Rob Bell are really a part. Now, John MacArthur and Doug Wilson obviously predate youngsters like Nadia Bolz-Weber and Mark Driscoll and Rob Bell, but it's all part of sort of the same, their attention is part of the same movement. And what had happened is that the seeker movement looked really accommodationist in many ways. And so that hardline antithetical dynamic really kicked in, and people are like, I'm sick of these squishy evangelicals, these evangellyfish, and I want someone who really believes, and that then often looks like hard lines. And MacArthur's part of that. And so, when the masks thing came and the pandemic thing came, MacArthur's got a big church and a big ministry. And so his church in California took the governor to court and won. His church plant in Edmonton didn't have such an easy time with it because, Canada, you and your let Jonathan Peugeot on an airplane, please, Canada. Can you just sort of lighten up on the COVID a little bit? Is it really that bad? So John MacArthur, he's out there, but he's sort of a theological cousin, but he's part of much more of this young, restless, and reformed. And, there's all these little internecine divisions in a long tradition like Calvinism. And so Calvinism is very broad. On one hand, you've got Marilyn Robinson, who identifies as a Calvinist, but she's quite progressive. And then you've got, Mark Driscoll doesn't anymore, but you've got John MacArthur out there, and Doug Wilson, and John Piper, and Tim Keller, and Paul Vanderklay, and the Reformed Church of America. And it's a big tent, even though some members of the tent don't like talking to each other. What is the difference between power and authority? Go ahead.
I was just going to say, it sounds incredibly painful to claim that you believe in God, yet claim that there's no such thing as a miracle anymore. I've never even heard of such a thing. It sounds so absurd. Good grief.
They're out there. No, and so the Dutch Reformed, like there's a story of a guy was a missionary in the OPC, that's the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, which for certain people on the conservative end of the Christian Reformed Church, they'll kind of go back and forth into the OPC. So the English Presbyterians are wired a little bit differently from the Dutch Calvinists. And that's a cultural difference. The Dutch have a long cultural tradition of tolerance. The Netherlands was sort of a fringe area of Europe where people escaping the bigger tyrannical places. So the Netherlands and Switzerland sort of share that in some ways, but again, they're still culturally different. So the Dutch Reformed sort of have a longer tradition of tolerance that some Presbyterian groups can get really hard-lined. So there was a missionary who was praying. He was a missionary in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, and he was just praying, just privately, his OPC prayers, and he found himself praying in tongues. And he did not plan this, and he didn't necessarily want it or expect it. It wasn't Pentecostal, but he had a problem because the Orthodox Presbyterian Church was quite secessionist. And I know some people in the CRC who are secessionist. One of my colleagues in the Dominican Republic was a secessionist, not in terms of seceding from the Union, but that the miracles ended with the age of the apostles. And this kind of is another legacy of what happened in the Reformation. So there's a lot of things that tie this stuff together, but I just find it hard to be a secessionist, partly because I don't think the world works like modernists want it to. And I think the world is just too big and too fuzzy. And I've just seen weird things, and it's like, I'm not going to get real fussy about these boxes and labels. So, but yeah, they're out there. Difference between power and authority. That is a great question. This question and answer today is not worthy of that question. I liked, I got to get back to him. So many people, Glenn, the Irishman who was doing it. So many people want to do conversations, and I think, yeah, okay, but then we don't find the slot, and that's why I started the rando slots. But the conversation that Peugeot had about principalities and cities and authority, that was a favorite conversation of mine, because I thought how Peugeot laid out what authority was really good. Authority is something like legitimate power, but there can be illegitimate power. So authority sort of has power built into it, but it's less coercive than what sort of passes for today's valence on the word power. Andy Crouch has written quite a bit about power, and it's so funny how people are like, whoa, those are power dynamics. Well, there's all power dynamics all over the place. Questions are legitimate, right, wrong. You're not going to get away from the use of power. Power and agency are deeply tied. So, like I said, that question is not worthy of today's question and answer, but it's a great question. And I'd refer you to Peugeot's conversation about authority. I've played it in a number of my videos. And when I really like it because he illustrates it with a teacher. And I don't talk about my wife a lot on the podcast because I think she'd be nervous if she heard I was. But my wife is a terrific teacher, and she's a grade school teacher. And the reason I know she's a terrific teacher is because I've seen her with her kids. She's a Waldorf teacher, which means that she has the same group of kids from 1st to 8th grade. She's only been through one class. She's in 3rd grade now with her kids, and that's been disrupted by the pandemic, blah, blah, blah. But I'll tell you something. When she graduated those kids from that class at 8th grade, all those kids know she would take a bullet for them. And most of those kids would take a bullet for her. That's authority. That's authority. Authority is power and love wed. And that's why there are people who have illegitimate authority or don't use authority properly. But, Peugeot, I think, nicely laid it out that the good teacher demands a lot of his or her students, but also deeply loves their students. You can find that in the book of James. God disciplines those he loves. He loves Israel. How do we know? He disciplines Israel. He loves Christians. How do we know? He disciplines Christians. No, I thought when I became a Christian, everything was supposed to be rainbows and unicorns. I don't know where you got that idea. You certainly didn't get it from the Bible. So that's really what authority is. It's power and love combined. Now, when power is not used with love, bad things happen. And it's not authoritative. So it's a great question. It's one of these questions that you can probably spend good portions of your life meditating upon. And if you do, you'll gain wisdom. All right. Boy, we're just...
Hey, Paul, can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
This is actually not to the power and authority question, but whenever you're talking about John MacArthur, sorry, I was on a different computer and my mic on that one didn't work, so I had to switch real quick. So I'm a Pentecostal, and actually kind of my only exposure to John MacArthur is on this cessationist topic. And whenever I first, and it's, to me, it was really staggering whenever I first heard him, because it wasn't just that he doesn't believe that miracles can happen. It's that if you speak in tongues, it's satanic and it's of the devil.
Yes.
That hit me like a ton of bricks whenever I heard that. And it got me, you guys were talking earlier about getting mad about things. I tend to not get mad about too many things. I was very furious about that. Like, I've been a Christian for, at this point, over 20 years, and I probably heard that probably about 10 years ago. So I had been a Christian for 10, 12 years whenever I heard that.
Yeah.
And the only thing that comes to mind for me, and I struggle with this because I don't want to attribute this to anybody, but the only description that I have to describe what I think is going on with that, of where a religious leader is looking at the move of the Holy Spirit and calling it satanic, is the episode of where the Pharisees are blaspheming against the Holy Spirit. And I don't want to call that the unforgivable sin, but I cannot think of a closer contemporary example of something like that. And I know you're just, I agree with the modern Christians are too hard on Pharisees point that you made earlier. But I was curious as to what you thought about that connection.
Part of the reason I try to be careful with the employment of hard lines is because they tend to beget more hard lines. And I think Jesus talks about that when he warns against condemning others. Judge not that you be not judged, because the measure that you use will be used against you. It's exactly what Jesus says. And, this is very Peugeotian, but you watch that, and it's simply a pattern in the world that hardlining begets other hard lines. And so this is part of the irony that I watch in the contemporary space where, I'm not gonna listen to anything Jordan Peterson says because he had Ben Shapiro on his podcast. So I try not to meet hard lines with hard lines, because then you just get a battle. And yeah, I completely understand what you're saying. And so I told the story about this missionary, and he quietly left the OPC and joined the CRC because he continued to want a conservative, reformed denomination, but one in which he could say, you know, I found myself speaking in tongues, and I don't really see it being the manifestation of Satan in my life. I find it helps my prayer life. I don't brag about it. I don't boast about it. I do it quietly. And of the devil, no. Now, and that's why I think, judge not that ye be not judged is also in John MacArthur's Bible. And so when I look at that verse, it's an admonition to be careful, because John Vervaeke has talked about, when he was young, his experience with the quote unquote unforgivable sin, blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. My take on that, which I inherited from my father, is that blasphemy against the Holy Spirit is basically continued resistance to the Spirit's work in your life. And I completely understand interpreting it as labeling the work of the Spirit as the work of the devil. But in how many different conflicts within the church, you could apply this to the same-sex marriage conflict. For some people, friends of mine, the inclusion and affirmation of same-sex couples in the church, this is the work of the Spirit in our midst. And for you Christians to say that this is demonic, that's blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. Now, I don't think that, but that's why I'm careful with these hard lines, because in some ways, even though each of us must in our own lives make our decisions about what we think God is and isn't calling us to do, and how God is and isn't calling us to live. It sounds terribly libertarian, but when we get up and make pronouncements, I think we got to be careful. And so will the Lord judge John MacArthur according to his hardline pronouncements? Yep. Will his judgments be hard-lined on John MacArthur? So I had a situation once where I was in trouble with someone because I got to be real careful with this kind of story. Someone was doing something, and it was sort of a gray area. And the person had disclosed this to me in confidence. And so therefore, not only was the issue that the particular behavior was in a gray area, but also it was disclosed to me in confidence. Now, this has nothing at all to do with harm of children or sexual violations or anything like that. Pastors are mandatory reporters. I get all that. This was nothing near any of that. But for this person, for these two people, it was an important thing, partly because of this person's story and their background and what they had been in their life. And this person was very angry with me, and this person eventually left the church. This person was very angry with me that I didn't not only draw a hard line and enforce a hard line and act in all of these other ways in a very hard line way about this behavior in this other person. And they were very upset, and they went to my church council. They talked to other clergy. I mean, to one degree or another, they came after me. Now, I knew that was not a fight they were going to win, because number one, the issue itself was a gray area. And number two, I held confidentiality, which in a case like this, pastors are sworn in their vows to hold confidentiality. And the issues in which I must break confidentiality are fairly small and quite clear, and are actually in legal statutes in the United States. And none of this came close. So when this person tried to get me in trouble, I knew that they didn't have a leg to stand on, because they're going to other people and basically saying, Paul should have broken confidentiality in this matter, and he did not. And anybody who heard that and understood confidentiality would say, no. In fact, if he had broken confidentiality, we would have had more to say to him than we do in this case. And so I was talking with this other person about it. And I said to this person, would you like me to treat you in the way that you are asking me to treat this other person? In other words, there are things that I see in your life that I think are not good and not right. Would you like me to call you to account to them? Shall I list them for you? And then the person kind of said, well, what do you mean? And so then I started. And you know what? They didn't like it. Big surprise. And, I think they left the church at least as much, because I treated them in exactly the same way they demanded that I treat this other person. And I didn't like it. And that's why I think we need to be careful with hard lines. And again, I'm not saying that there aren't times for hard lines. If someone is being, and we got to be careful with this word abused, someone is being abused, call the police. I'm not one that's going to give aid and comfort to certain kinds of things going on in the church at all. But there's a lot of hardlining that goes on in the church. And part of dealing with the church has to be figuring out how to deal with hardliners. And what Jesus says about judging and hard lines, I think it's absolutely right. I think Jesus is basically saying, be careful of your hard lines, because they will be applied to you. And that's why a lot of people will, I bother people on both sides, because some people are bothered that I listen to Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Peugeot and John Vervaeke. Or that, why don't I call out such and such a person on such and such a defect? And then those are the people usually over on the hard line sort of things. Then there's people on the other side, on the squishy side, and they'll say, you listen to a Doug Wilson video? Yeah, I've listened to more than one. I've read his blog too. And you know what? He's got some good points. And, John MacArthur on the mask thing, we didn't practice what he practiced, but was he right in terms of the legal thing? Well, yeah. So the fact is, I think wisdom dictates that you figure out a way to live in the world with both hardliners and with the squishies. And so, yeah, I think it's to Andrea with the Bangs credit that she had the Decoding the Gurus on her podcast not once, but twice, and that she's wrestling with those issues. And for that reason, I hold her in esteem, because she's doing the right thing. So don't be afraid of the hardliners. Don't be afraid of the squishies. Figure out how to live in a world with hardliners and squishies, because in every one of you, there's a squishy you and there's a hardliner you. And part of working out your consciousness Congress is figuring out what wisdom looks like in a world of squishy and hard lines. So, okay. Antithetical. Power is the ability to inflict change. Inflict, there's an interesting word choice. Authority is holding power with wisdom through having earned it. A toddler with a loaded firearm has power. A soldier in combat has authority. Yeah, that's great. Really nice. That's how I understand it. Though I'd like to hear Paul's answer. Well, I guess I like your answer. That's a good one. Paul, how often, you often say that the only video game you play is Civilization, capital C. Civ 6 right now. Do you ever realize that you are playing a very spiritual game? Oh, yes. I sometimes wonder, would I like to live in that little world that I created? The simulation isn't so good in that little world, though. And the game sort of breaks down the longer you get into it. So I start far more games than I finish. You are not the ruler of your civilization. You are, in fact, the power of that civilization, the spiritual entity that directs it. I am indeed. I'm drunk with power when I play Civilization. Gunner F. Hi, Paul. Hi, Gunner. I'm new to the Discord, but I've been watching your videos for a while. I'm currently a professor teaching Introduction to Philosophy at a secular university. I get nervous when I deal with academics because I'm not an academic. I get a ton of stuff wrong. So, and I'm finding myself becoming more and more influenced by those ideas coming out of the meaning crisis discussions with Peugeot, Vervaeke, Peterson, and yourself. Do you have any book, article, or essay recommends for me that I could incorporate in my teaching to help my students better understand the meaning crisis and how they might find purpose and fulfillment in our empty consumerist age? I don't really. And part of what, so when I started in this YouTube thing, I had less time for books. And I'm trying to address that by addressing some other things in my schedule, because I've got a good pile of books I really want to get through. And I still continue to manage to get through books, especially when they have audiobooks, because then I can kind of spell them. But I don't know. It's so difficult because on one hand, these issues are so perennial. C.S. Lewis was dealing with exactly these same things. But at the same time, the culture has changed so fast that if you read C.S. Lewis's stuff, especially if, let's say, you're an undergrad, there's so much that's just going to be lost. And that's Lewis, who's remarkably articulate. So I think people are trying to write some books on this stuff. You know, I think, but even, you know, even Peterson's books, you know, they're in this self-help genre for a reason. And I don't say that dismissively, but figuring out how to apply this to, let's say, undergrads, especially because undergrads are in some ways sometimes just trying to get through a system. These crazy systems that we create. So I don't really have any book recommendations off the top of my head. Maybe you should write it. I mean, so, you know, people sometimes say, well, why hasn't Peterson had you on his podcast yet? You know, part of what was good about the little sit down that we had with Jordan and Tammy was I get to know each other, because, you know, Peterson knows that I'm making videos, and Peterson's heard of me through Peugeot and Vervaeke, but you got to understand that Peterson is an enormously driven, enormously busy individual, and he's an academic. And you know the thing about academics, they're biased towards words and print. That's the academy. And this new YouTube thing, this is different. And podcasts and yammering pastors. So if I had a really good book on this stuff, if I had written one, you know, Jordan could read that and then have me on his podcast and we'd talk about it. The problem that Jordan would have is, you know, how to figure out who on earth PVK is and where to start a conversation. Now, the little half-hour talk we had in April of 2018, I think it was, I led that conversation because it was sort of one of these Patreon deals, and I had a half hour and I could ask questions. And so those of you who are still waiting for me to open up more rando slots, I mean, I had a list basically of points. And even when we went to the meeting, when Rick and I went to the meeting, I had some goals in my head. Basically, I don't want to leave this little half-hour interchange without saying this, and this. And you have to kind of weave it into the conversation so it doesn't come out badly. And that's something that takes work and experience. But as a pastor, you get used to doing it, because often when you meet with people, it's like, on one hand, it's just got to be a congenial conversation. On the other hand, because you're a pastor, you've got a sneaky agenda for their life. And so you learn to kind of get those things in. So I'd like to do some writing at some point. If I ever will, we'll see. Might not be able to do it until retirement. But I'm sure that there are some books out there and some people can probably recommend them. But what's happening now, I think in some ways, so in the 30s and 40s and 50s, Lewis, Barfield, they were part of a revival of sorts. And I think we're about to have another one like that. But, you know, Chesterton, I mean, just go ahead and read Chesterton. I mean, the guy's a great writer. But this stuff, in terms of its contextuality, doesn't have a very long shelf life. So we need to write those books. Father Hugh. I suppose the I'm just getting used to the FR meaning father. I mean, I've just been so Protestant for so long. Do you think one can rationally infer God, number one, or just number two? Can we show the existence of the transcendent Christ ex nihilo of classic theism? I do think, I think, in fact, in some ways, it's easier to conceptualize God, number one, from below. And I think so because, quite clearly, many have done it over time. I think God, number two, is much more the God of revelation. He's the God that calls Abraham out of his father's tents. He's the God that arrests Moses while he's watching sheep as a burning bush. He's the God that stops Paul in his tracks on the road to Damascus. He's the God that shows up on Sinai and says to Israel what the terms of their marriage ought to be. So I think actually God, number one, is easier. I think that's in many ways the God that Paul is talking about in Romans 1 and 2, the God that the pagans should know. And I'll be in Romans 2 again. We have Sunday school class again this week. Didn't have it last week for Easter because we had to get together with our daughter church, who also meets with us. It's when Paul in Romans 2 basically says to the Jews, hey, you know, some of these pagans are more righteous than you. Ouch. But how would those pagans know? And what God would they know? And that way they'd know God, number one. And I think in some of the ways in which, like the Greek god of victory or the fates, I think these were all sort of pagan rational attempts to know the Arenic God. So now, can we show the existence of the transcendent creator ex nihilo of classical theism? Showing is a very hard thing, because showing relies on the seeing of another. And that's always the preacher's challenge. Can I show you this? I don't know. Can they see it? So I think Jesus says, those who have eyes to see and ears to hear. Jesus is saying, I'm showing you, but you ain't seeing. The prophet said that too. So I think we can show, but the question of whether they'll see, that's a whole different question. And I think that's where the Spirit comes in. If so, we must get beyond the totality or the highest level pattern of Peugeot's very helpful cosmic hierarchy. You're God number 2. Well, I think that's right. Lest we collapse into panentheism. He made me say it. Oh, Luke is going to be, except it's in a negative context. Luke is going to be so upset. I haven't seen any of your engaging Peugeot's school even trying to infer from this hierarchy of the creator of it. For example, the symbolic character of the cosmos for the human mind is sometimes taken as pointing in that direction. But how exactly? In fact, numerous of your interlocutors seem to be similar to Nagel, David Chalmers, and even your, even good old Sam, who accept the crucial place of the first person perspective, but see it as leading to some form of panpsychism. They all, with Peterson, demur on deducing a transcendent God. Yeah, I think this is a valid point. And this is where, the likes of, let's say, Kierkegaard or Karl Barth. Now, I don't know, from which tradition, because father could mean Orthodox or father could mean Roman Catholic, or Anglican or something. Well, you're in the room. Hugh, can you talk? I mean, you want to elaborate a little bit more?
Well, hi. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. Always impressed how open you are to dialogue with everybody. I'm from the Catholic tradition, so I'm sort of from a tradition that has said, for instance, that the First Vatican Council, that Romans 1:19 that you did refer to, does mean that we can rationally show that when we say in the Creed, Creator of all things, we mean a God who is different from the creation, transcendent of it. And whilst I'm extremely interested in your stuff and Pajo as well, and Peterson, it seems to me that they are slipping towards some form of pantheism. I know they're not, well, particularly Pajo is not in his belief, but I think his presentation of the hierarchy leaves us with the sort of highest level, but it doesn't get anywhere near a transcendent creator of all things. He believes that because he's within the classical tradition, as I call it. He believes in the creeds. And so he certainly believes it. But his excellent articulation of the hierarchy that has been discovered, for instance, I think by modern science within the cosmos, does not enable us to get beyond it. And certainly from the Catholic tradition, that's a problem. Although, I just think he's going in the right direction. But somehow we just need to realize there's another step to go, because, Romans 1:19 does say you can show by reason that there is a transcendent creator.
I think this is, where God number 2 comes in, and where it's, in Romans, Paul says, basically Paul in Romans 2 basically challenges the Jews and says, you can have the law, but if you don't obey the law, the pagans can mop the floor with you in terms of their virtue and their righteousness. And so, be careful of your self-righteousness. but then again, he'll then take the next step. That's where I'm coming to in Romans 2 this coming week, where he also said, at the same time, God chose you to fellowship with, to tabernacle with, and he came down on Sinai and he spoke with Moses. And so I think this clearly is the path that the church takes and manifests in what we do. I think part of the reason we're seeing the emphasis that we're seeing right now is because of sort of the dance with the new atheists, because the new atheists made a lot of noise debunking the super thing in the sky. And the church wasn't terribly quick on its feet or capable in the public realm to say, hey, wait a minute. God for us is not Zeus or Apollo. And I think so part of why Peterson and Peugeot have had the impact they've had is because even though they didn't take that tact against the new atheists, they sort of came around the other way and pointed out, well, actually, this God number one is really what our traditions, the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition, are built on. I just saw, why on earth is Peterson and Peugeot, why are they being so effective evangelistically when, Peterson has all these questions about the narrative touching the physical. And it's when just watching all of that I began to see, oh, Peterson is basically helping our culture remember what it knew before the Enlightenment. And so is Peugeot. And once at a very deep level we begin to remember that, then God number two sort of sits properly in the story.
Wow, well, that's very helpful. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I suppose I sort of, clearly they've come at it from a new way, I think, from human experience, and it's proved very fruitful in sort of rebuilding something akin to the Christian vision. But at the same time, the atheists have shown that if you don't have God number one rationally defended, there's a risk that it's not gonna hold together. But having said that, you're absolutely right. Pageau and Peterson have their fruits. You will know them, and they've taken us to God number two. That's true.
And I think the fact that they, even though at least Peterson sort of stands on the frontier, I'm speaking psychologically now, and all that, so many others walk over the line because somehow in them they know, no, I must worship. And then, if they're going to an Orthodox church or a Catholic church or a Protestant church, it's going to be God number two. That's who you're addressing. It's a little fruitless to talk to the sky.
Well, it does have to be a personal relationship, though, doesn't it? And if frankly, God number two, as in as much as he is the higher level of Pageau's hierarchy, is not someone you can have a personal relationship, really. Although you're right, in terms of the salvation history and Romans 2 and whatever, he is someone you can have a personal relationship with. But I think to ground that, you need to show God that he is also, and fundamentally, God number one.
Yeah. It's funny when you talk to Pageau, because on one hand, he's like many of us, he sort of has two modes. One of his mode is sort of this secular voice where he tries to engage a world that doesn't share Christian assumptions. But then I think if you would meet him in church, I think he'd sound a little different.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks for being here, and thanks for your great question.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Sporwell. Paul, what is the Christian reason for marriage versus remaining as we are born alone? It is not good for man to be alone. It's a Jewish reason too. I should finish the question. Evolution would say children. Modernity would say romantic love or constant sex. Constant sex? Does marriage give you constant sex? I'm not having sex right now. I can promise you that. What at the same level of answer would Christianity say marriage qua marriage, not marriage to a particular person? And this, I think, is the great argument for male-female. And Genesis 2, I think, is the answer in terms of that drama. So you have the man, and then you have the animals, and there's not a helpmate suitable to him. Giraffe, no. Dogs are great. Dogs are great, but you don't marry your dog. Horse is really useful. You don't marry your horse. And so the man falls into a great sleep, and he's, the rib, that's sort of an unfortunate, he's sort of split in half. I like how Peugeot has it in his symbolic world thing that you start out with. She's, we say it all the time, she's my better half. And I think in a scientific age, we want to delineate it down to an essence. So what is the essence of marriage? And I think each time we do this, I love that David Sachs talk about the Greek mind and the Jewish mind, how the Greek mind is sort of analytical and it breaks things into their constituent pieces. And it breaks it down. It tries to look for an essence in the middle. The Hebrew mind is a synthetic compositional thing. And so I don't want to have to choose between procreation or partnership or even just temperament wise. Men and women are different. And so temperamentally, two are better than one because they'll balance each other. We have two hemispheres of our brain. Within a marriage, we now have four. Now you say, well, what about a throuple? Then you can have six. No, because we can't. I mean, the biblical record on polygamy is bad idea. I talked to a friend of mine who's a missionary to the Muslims, and he said something to the effect of, there's a lot of polygamy in that and in this traditional Islamic culture, and he basically says it's the men just hate it. You might think, oh, constant sex. Oh, I tell my wife often, honey, I don't know. I have enough trouble dealing with one woman. I don't know what I would do with two. So I don't know that we can, to answer your question, I don't want to boil it down to one thing, because the answer in Genesis 2 is not one thing. It's all the things. It's more things than I can list. And that's why male-female is unique and important. If you look at my video about same-sex marriage, as I've for 3 hours just thinking out loud about this thing, I think it's basically because in terms of the hierarchy, there's no better thing that we can do. Now, within the age of decay, Jesus, to the best of our knowledge, was single. Paul, to the best of our knowledge, was single. Paul has some words to say about, well, singleness, you can devote yourself to the Lord. And that gets expressed in some traditions as, monastic orders where men and the women are joined to Christ in something like a marriage. So I think if you're looking for a story about the biblical view of marriage, Genesis 2 is the place to look. And it isn't just procreation. It isn't just companionship. It isn't just partnership. It's all of those things together, very much in a Hebraic way of thinking. All right, QWERTY up. Have the Industrial Revolution and its consequences been a disaster for the human race? Yes, and a blessing. And so much. So again, one of the Peugeot videos that I really liked recently was his treatment of the Book of Enoch. And he gives quite a bit more clarity about he and Machu's ideas about technology. Some of that comes out in his conversation with Paul Kingsnorth. And some of that comes out in his, which was it, the Brett Weinstein, or was it the James Lindsay? When he talks about the new creation, I mean, Peugeot basically sees that the new creation has the incorporation of technology in it, because we begin in a garden and we end in a city. And the Industrial Revolution, part of it has been a disaster, partly because of, and Peugeot and Kingsnorth, I thought, treated this well in that video. We have looked at our sister, as C.S. Lewis calls her, nature, in a particular sense of the word. We have looked at our sister nature, and in a sense, in the Industrial Revolution, we've raped her. We've abused her. We've taken advantage of her. Now, we've been at war with her to some degree since our rebellion, because when we rebelled against our father and our sister's father, we started one big messy family fight, and the Industrial Revolution in some ways has attacked our sister, who is at the same time, deeply part of us. But at the same time, we have been able to use some of these tools to hopefully restore our sister and understand some of the ways that we have wounded her. So, as is almost always the case in human society, we do good and we do bad, and we can't tell the difference. I'd say the Industrial Revolution has, and Tripital's answering my questions for me. That's a good thing. I don't have to answer them. He's giving good answers. Rick looks up like, who's answering these questions? That's Paul's job. Be careful. I'd say the Industrial Revolution has been quite a good thing for me. Not sure about other people. Quintessential. Well, we're running out of time. I started your conversation with Aaron on the resurrection, and I'm wondering of your thoughts on the topic of boldness in the Bible. I recently did a study on the Greek word parousia, translated often as confidence or boldness. I discovered that it can be used as freedom of speech, openness to speech. That's interesting. Leaving a witness that something deserves to be remembered. As you age in your walk with Christ, have you discovered greater freedom of speech in sharing your belief that the physical resurrection of Jesus is the hope of mankind? I think we often confuse freedom of speech with license of speech, licentiousness. Oh, thoughts. Oh, fun question. I haven't really studied that. I noted that in the book of Acts, one of the hallmarks of the presence of the Holy Spirit in the lives of the apostles, who in Luke were rather hapless, suddenly they have power. And the their rivals look at them and remark about their boldness. So I think you're onto something. And age does, go and older people are fun to hang out with sometimes, because sometimes they will say exactly what's on their mind and they can get away with it because they're old. They're like, wow, there's old fart in the nursing home just spewing what they think. Yeah, that's right. They're doing it. They're like, what are you going to do to me now? I'm already in a diaper. I only got a few years to live. I'm living in this house. I'm living in this home run by some administrator. I've got, immigrants wiping my butt and wiping my mouth. I'm going to tell you exactly what I think. Not quite there yet, but yeah. And the case that, so part of the difference between the East Coast when I was growing up, not a big Asian population in Paterson, and California when I moved here, Asian cultures tend to have a high degree of reverence for those of us with gray hair. And now, not all older people are wise. I can promise you that. But there is a better chance that if you live long enough, you'll gain wisdom. And so we should listen to our elders, and we should honor them and respect them. And sometimes they're foolish, but yeah, boldness. Sometimes they get bold. Ruben Lone. I recently heard that Timothy Keller thinks that our culture is going through a crisis of hope. How do you think this relates to the meaning crisis? Yeah, I don't know what Tim is talking about. I think he's right. And if he's talking about the fact that so many of our visions of the future are dystopian, that certainly could be a crisis of hope. And that would probably lead into, Vervaeke and Peugeot first got together because Vervaeke wrote a book about zombies. So he could very much be talking about a similar thing. Vervaeke's meaning crisis, it helps highlight, I think, a lot of the cultural developments with respect to personhood and agency. And I don't know that Keller, I listened to a lot of Tim Keller from about 2006 to 2012. And so in terms of what he wrote and preached and spoke about during those years, I heard a ton. I haven't followed him very closely since then. So I don't know necessarily what he's talking about. Chad the Alcoholic. Isn't it strange that concepts or things considered ugly or antithetical are seemingly more objective, whereas contextual beauty is more subjective? For instance, a song or narrative movie that tells a story picked as a random sample played as in reverse is objectively not a work of beauty. I may be way off in this, but was wondering what you think about this. Yeah, it's a good question. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and based on psychology, we know that symmetrical faces, certain aspects, certain lines, certain patterns are universally seen as beauty. That's a funny thing. Are we doing on time? Oh boy. Ever thought on taking a nap on those couches outside? If you'd see the couch, you'd know the answer. I think I am going to mark this one here. Oh, where's a me mark? There's a me mark. Okay. So then we'll start with Leaf Whiz next week. So, I would like to thank you and your church for your ministries. Well, you're welcome. I'm glad we can do it. He's led to my best friend converting to Christianity, which is a lifelong prayer of mine, of having someone close to share my Christian faith with. So again, big thanks to you and the community. On a darker note, see, now I'm going to do the question. On a darker note, I've been doing research into demonic possession by reading about the experience from Roman Catholic exorcist ministries. And I wondered about what is the traditional views of the Calvinist Church regarding the demonic and how to fight it. This was one of the casualties of the Protestant Reformation in some ways, that some wisdom and tradition was lost. Now, it's not so much there in Luther, but as the Enlightenment increasingly took hold, it was easier and easier to dismiss or pathologize, and then in the 20th century, medicalize some of these questions. And one of the really cool things, so most of my videos this week were from a particular conversation, which I thought was an outstanding conversation. And one of the things she said about a lot of Protestants who want to go to the Roman Catholic Church is they want to go to the Roman Catholic Church before the Protestant Reformation. And guess what? The Protestant Reformation changed the Roman Catholic Church too. And the Roman Catholic Church had to deal with, look at many of the French philosophes. They were molded in France, deeply Roman Catholic France. So the question, and I actually wrestle with these kind of questions as I try to talk about our use of this word spirit now. And some of Father Hugh's concerns I share, because some person very much got confused when I called Jordan Peterson an exorcist, and I noted in his conversation with John McWhorter that he is exorcising John McWhorter. Now, we can split the use of the word, because I do not believe John McWhorter is demon-possessed in the sense of this question. At the same time, there are principalities and powers, and not all of them are good. And so what language do we have to talk about this? This gets into some church fathers things, and in terms of, it gets into the John MacArthur question and speaking in tongues. So, I should finish writing the question. What tools should one use? And so a lot of this has sort of arisen in the Protestant world via the Pentecostal tradition. And unfortunately for the Pentecostals, their tradition is very new. And so I think the Roman Catholic Church has a serious leg up in that the Roman Catholics have been working on this stuff for a very long time, and I would imagine have lots of experience and wisdom that they bring to it. Because what I wouldn't want people to hear when I talk about Jordan Peterson exorcising John McWhorter is that I am skeptical about the kinds of demons that you're referring to in this question, because I am not. But figuring out the language and the intersection is not easy. We talked about this in seminary, And, basically my Christian Reformed pastoral care professor, Mel Hugin, uncle to my friend Rod Hugin. Yeah, the CRC is like one big Dutch family in some ways. Basically he said, this should be considered when you've pretty much eliminated all other variables from the equation. And it's not a bad first answer, but it's a very modernist answer. It's a modernist answer that makes accommodation and has an understanding of the reality and the ontology of the spiritual realm. The Roman Catholic tradition makes more sense if one takes into account the fight against the demonic with the, for example, usage of holy water, other practices like the rosary prayer, repentance, etc. So you'll find Pentecostals not using any of that. But I wouldn't say that the Pentecostals aren't also doing some of this work. Virgin Mary is seen as effective ally to be called upon in that fight, and I wonder if this is one of the larger reasons for the part she plays in Roman Catholic Church. I don't want to reduce variables here. I think there are a lot of reasons why Mary is more prominent in the Orthodox and Catholic traditions and less prominent in the Protestant tradition. And there are upsides and downsides all along the way in that. Sorry for bringing in this eerie topic. No, it's fine. But according to the books, likes to hide in the shadows. And that's an important thing. It does like to hide. And, yeah. So when I talk about levels, just like the farmer grows rice or corn, and the farmer has a dog, and the dog can run in the midst of the corn. And the corn, what does a corn know? Corn knows stuff. If we don't get too hung up on our experience of consciousness as knowing, corn knows when to grow and not grow. Corn knows when to thrive and not thrive. Corn knows how to multiply. Corn knows all this stuff. And so there's a bunch of, now we're going to anthropomorphize a little bit. There's a bunch of corn in Iowa that is full of its own self-righteousness because it just knows it's completely surrounded by corn. And according to some fields in Northwest Iowa, corn is going to take over the world. And the corn might kind of feel jostled a bit by the, Chris made a lovely video about this, by the dog running amidst the field. The corn doesn't know that dog real well. And the corn might not understand the farmer's role in the corn's experience of world hegemony. But the farmer has designs on the corn. The Enlightenment Lab Leak basically said, we're going to reduce variables. And then, wow, we can learn a lot. So everybody started walking around with their hand over one eye. Well, that's good. If you're trying to shoot, you look out of one eye and you line up the sight so you don't have both eyes open because the other eye is a problem. That's kind of what science does. But life isn't shooting. So the Enlightenment says, no levels above us. And now that the winter of modernity is ending, you listen to Curtis Yarvin, he's not aware of this little corner of the internet. And you listen to him and it's like, oh, no, there's levels. Who has designs on us? And so, read Screwtape Letters. And one might look at Screwtape Letters and say, oh, Lewis is making light of the demonic. Possibly. But it's helpful in that we begin to realize we're not at the top of the hierarchy. And that really bothers us. So, great question. All right. I'm going to resist reading the next question because it's 1:10 and we should land the plane. Been doing this for 2 hours and I didn't really feel like doing it at all, but I kind of got into it. And so I appreciate everyone gathering here today, and happy birthday, Andre. And hope you enjoyed your birthday and it went well. Sorry, Andrea, for putting you on the spot with respect to Chris Kavanaugh and Matt, and I hope I haven't hurt their feelings, and I applaud your attempt to not get captured by your audience and to stay high in openness and think critically about things. So yeah, and thanks to Father Hugh for checking in here. Lovely to have new guests, and for all of you who gathered here. So I'm going to have Rick end the transmission, and then I'm going to go sit down with Rick and review everything. And yep, thanks for joining us today.